Evening, everyone. Welcome to the museum. My name is Chris Malinsky. I'm the Janet L. Nolan Director of Curatorial and Educational Affairs at the Jule, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight for the Auburn Witness Prize honoring Jake Adam York. The Witness Prize is a valued and long-standing collaboration with the Department of English and the Southern Humanities Review. And we're delighted that the Witness Prize issue, again, which I hope you'll get a copy if you don't have one already, features an object from the museum's collection on the cover. This year, the featured object is Home by the artist William Gropper, part of the Advancing American Art Collection, one of the cornerstones of the museum's permanent collection, and currently an object on view in our galleries. You can see a reproduction here behind me. The artist who painted this was born in New York to Jewish immigrants from Ukraine and Romania. He painted and drew satirical cartoons to address social issues of his time. His early exposure to his parents' experience in the oppressive garment industry reinforced his own personal commitment to themes such as limited social mobility, unsafe working conditions, and low wages. The painting and art collection depicts an obscured figure, lovingly rendered in an act of physical labor, toiling in the rubble of what was presumably once a home. We selected this in response to this year's winning poem, Follow by Erika Jing. Likewise, the poem connects to materials of labor and love, such as quilts, sweaters, ribbons, and pearls. From a dirt road to a watermelon grove, a narrator follows their mother through imagined memories, tenderly piecing together her portrait. We're delighted that we have Erika with us tonight, who will read the winning poem in a moment, following the reading by our Witness Prize judge for 2024, Victoria Chang. I hope that some of you will join us again on November 7th, when Victoria will return to the museum for an ekphrastic poetry workshop inspired by the art on view in our galleries. If you're interested, reach out directly to me or look at our event calendar online and you can sign up to save a spot. We're going to keep the group, I think, small so it can be an intimate gathering. I'd also like to extend my deepest appreciation to our organizing partners and the entire museum staff for the important work surrounding this program. I'm also grateful to our museum donors for their investments to present these and other programs, and our unit leadership, President Christopher B. Roberts. Now, please, for an additional introduction, join me in welcoming an Auburn student and the assistant managing editor for the Southern Humanities Review, Jace LeConte, to introduce our poets.
Southern Humanities Review established the Auburn Witness Poetry Prize in 2014 as a way to honor Jake Adam York, an award-winning celebrated Alabama poet and alumnus of Auburn University. His poetry examined race relations in the American South, uplifted the civil rights movement, and interrogated his own privilege and complicity in racist institutions. York was a poet taken too early at the age of 40 due to a stroke. However, his impact on the literary world was significant. A teacher and an author of 5 books, York was also an editor. He founded the journal Coppernickel in 2002 and acted as a contributing editor. He founded the journal, as a contributing editor for magazines like Shenandoah, Story South, and the Kenyon Review. The Auburn Witness Poetry Prize honors York and paves the way for fellow poets whose work resonates deeply to enrich the mind and stir the heart as a part of Southern Humanities Review's mission statement. This year, the editors are thrilled to publish our runner-ups, Andrew Hermit, Wesley Rothman, Felicia Zamora, as well as our finalists, Gregory Emilio, Jenny Chi, Geneva Tolan, and Shur Ryer Eskandari Zanjani, as well as our winner, Erika Jing, whose award-winning poem you'll hear momentarily. Together, these poets address topics such as climate change, the impact of war, the Trail of Tears, the death of aid workers in Gaza, and suppressed history and trauma through their work. It's not only a privilege to share these poems, but a responsibility. The editors of Southern Humanities Review want to thank everyone who makes this prize possible, but especially the poets who trust Southern Humanities Review with their words, without whom this prize would not exist. Now, I'm honored to introduce poet Victoria Chang, juror of the 2024 Witness Prize. Victoria Chang's publications include With My Back to the World, The Trees Witness Everything, Dear Memory, and Obit, which was named a New York Times notable book, a Time must-read book, and received the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Annis Field Wolf Book Award in Poetry, and the Penn Volker Award. It was also longlisted for a National Book Award and named the finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Griffin International Poetry Prize. She is the Bourne Chair of Poetry at Georgia Tech and the Director of Poetry at Tech. Now, please join me in welcoming Victoria Chang.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. And oh, wow, we got the back row all filled. Woohoo, back row. That's where I used to love to sit myself. I wanted to thank Chris and everyone who had a hand in planning this event. It's a whole staff of people. So thank you all. The Jule, Collins Smith Museum, and Jace and the Southern Humanities Review. And so happy to be here with Erika. I'll talk a little bit more about Erika and Jake in a minute, but I wanted to start reading some of my poems. Let me set my timer so I don't do anything terrible. Okay. Yeah, I'll just read some poems. I brought some slides, mostly because I'm a visual learner myself, so I like to look at things when I'm listening. I'm just going to read some poems from a few different books, and I'll just start with two poems from my book, Obit. And so my mother died of pulmonary fibrosis, and it's when your lungs harden and you gradually suffocate to death. And I started resisting writing elegies, and then I eventually wrote a bunch of elegies, essentially, that are shaped in the obituary form. So I only have a picture of this one. It's called My Mother's Teeth. Died twice, once in 1965, all pulled out from gum disease. Once again on August 3rd, 2015. The fake teeth sit in a box in the garage. When she died, I touched them, smelled them, thought I heard a whimper. I shoved the teeth into my mouth, but having two sets of teeth only made me hungrier. When my mother died, I saw myself in the mirror, her words around my mouth like powder from a donut. Her last words were in English. She asked for a Sprite. I wonder whether her last thought was in Chinese. I wonder what her last thought was. I used to think that a dead person's words die with them. Now I know that they scatter, looking for meaning to attach to like a scent. My mother used to collect orange blossoms in a small, shallow bowl. I passed the tree each spring. I always knew that grief was something I could smell, but I didn't know that it's not actually a noun, but a verb, that it moves. This one's called The Bees. The bees, 268 million years old from the Philippines, passed away on April 26, 2217 in Nome, Alaska. The detaching icebergs crushed the bees who used to fly over conference rooms. Once I nearly died in a small plane with a CEO, CFO, and COO during their IPO. On the ground, the CEO glared at me as if I had caused the storm, as if the yellow lights had come from my mind, as if the buzzing had come from my shaking, as if the lightning were a box I had tripped over. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had become estranged from a part of myself that wanted to stay alive, that wanted them to remain alive. In the same way, I had become estranged from my mother forever, but not from her death. Let me see, I can't remember what's next. Oh, okay, not yet. I'm going to read a few things from a book called Dear Memory. And when my mother passed away, I was really, after, cleaning up a lot of her stuff, because she liked to keep a lot of things. And I found boxes actually of like just documents. And I was really excited. I suddenly knew like what my grandmother's name was, where she was from, all these random things I never knew. But then at some point I thought, this is actually even harder because I have all these questions now. So sometimes answers just lead to more questions. So I started writing these epistolaries to my mother, which then became epistolary essays to everything, including abstract things like the body is not abstract, the body is physical, but abstract things and other people. So I'll just read one letter. It's called Dear Mother. I have so many questions. What city were you born in? What was your American birthday, your Chinese birthday? What did your mother do? What did your grandmother do? Who was your father, grandfather? It's too late now, but I would like to know. I would like to know why your mother followed Chiang Kai-shek, taking you and your 6 or 7 siblings across China to Taiwan. I would like to know what was said in that meeting. I would like to know who was in that meeting, where that meeting took place. I would like to know the people that were left behind. I would like to know if there are other people who look like me. I would like to know if you took a train, if you walked, if you had pockets in your dress, if you wore pants, if your hand was in a fist, or if it held a small stone. I would like to know if you thought the trees were black or green at night, if it was cold enough to see your breath, to sting your fingers. I would like to know who you spoke to along the way, if you had some preserved salty plums that we both love in your pocket. I would like to know if you carried a bag, if you had a book in your bag. I would like to know where you got your food for the trip. While I never knew your mother, father, or your siblings, I would like to have known your father. I would like to know what his voice sounded like, if it was brittle or pale, if it was blue or red. I would have liked to know the sound he made when he swallowed food. I would like to know if your mother was afraid. During college, I spent several weeks with her in Taiwan. She bought me baozi, or buns, every morning, the bao that steamed in small plastic bags with no ties, and sweet doujiang, or tofu milk, always too hot for me to drink. How she sat there and watched me eat, complained to me about your brother's wife. She complained of being sick and how no one would help her. Do you know how long it took me to figure out how to call an ambulance? And then when they came, she refused to go. I still remember how the 2 men stared at me as if I could move a country. Listen, it's the wind. That's the same wind from your countries. Sometimes, if I listen closely at night, I can hear you drop a small bag at the door. I hear the sound of the bough touching the ground and the wind trying to open the bag. But when I open the door, there's nothing there, just the same wind, thousands of years old. Happy birthday, wind. Happy birthday, mother. April 6th, 1940. I know this now. All the nurses, doctors, and morticians asked me, so I memorized it. Your American birthday, April 6th, 1940. I said again and again, as if I had known this my whole life. Eventually, I started wanting to put some photos in this thing that I was making, which turned out to be a book. And then I started writing little poems. And then I started cutting paper, and then I started messing around. So I'll just read you. That's my mother on the far right. I don't know who those people are, which I think is so interesting. We all find pictures, and it's like we know one person, and we have no idea who the other people are. Here's the poem. I wonder what the hat was trying to cover. The others have flowers on their dresses. All of your flowers were on the underside. Even then, your stare was slightly lower, looking right beneath where happiness begins. This is my mother on the very top. And so I'm assuming the person in the middle, who looks kind of like all of us, her grandmother, which would be my great-grandmother, and those are some of her siblings, maybe missing one that maybe wasn't born yet. Once you had to stand behind your grandmother who left a country, each of your feet lifted off the land onto the boat like nightingales. I imagine the night sky, you below deck, light coming from 2 moons, but only half of your face lit up. You stood still as the moons rearranged themselves. During the switch, language was lost at sea. When language belongs to no one, a door opens. Oh, not yet, okay. I really should look at my slides ahead of time. Okay, so I'll just read a few like really miniature poems too from this book called The Trees Witness Everything. And they're in these various, everyone knows what a haiku is, right? Yeah, how many syllables? Yeah, 575, good. Yeah, sometimes people say 575, other times they say 17. Both are the right answer. But I wrote a bunch of tiny poems that are like various different syllabic forms. Obviously, you know, characters in Asian languages are like, you know, usually one character, one syllable, doesn't quite translate into English syllables. But so I wrote these tiny poems, and then I also gave myself one more constraint, and I named the titles. I used the poet W.S. Merwin's titles, and you'll kind of see why they're just really capacious titles. And these were just sort of fun to write after obit. To age. When the stars hit the windows now, they turn into flies. Who knew they would come down? That's it. See, short. And they vary from 3 lines to 7 to 9, but I'll just read a few more here. Fly. What happened to the eagle that lost its wing and lived in the small cage, feral like silence? We stood there with our futures, filming with our phones. I wonder if the bird felt me replay it on the plane. Calling late. The men used to call at all hours, but what I miss most are the late night talks, ones where I held the phone so close it pressed like a gun. Little soul. I rode on your back until your knees broke, and now 1 mile left, I must toss you. When the war is over. I once saw the deer. They were all wearing blue scarves. We have finally finished killing everything. We are now looking ahead, but have killed past the future. Turning. My mother is dead. The lemons still turn yellow. The trout still stare emptily. Desire is still free. We still love many people, eat peaches as if kissing. The lovers. There is a wildfire starving on top of a lake. See how the water holds fire but cannot end it? We insist on love when all we want is mercy. The gods. The fact that leaves can't be put back on trees makes me think that you do not exist. Okay. So I will just read a few more here and then let Erika get up here. Are we doing okay so far? Does anyone know who Agnes Martin is? Raise your hand. Nobody? Oh, there are a few over there, all on that side. Oh, there are a few in the back. Okay. So Agnes Martin, does anyone like looking at art? Is anyone an artist? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, we're in a museum, so you have to say yes. Yes. So Agnes Martin was known for just grids and did a lot of other kinds of things, but is primarily known for her grid work. This one's called On a Clear Day, 1973. You might think not a big deal or things, but now look at that. So that one you just saw somewhere in the mix of all of those. You know, I just was asked by the MoMA in New York as a commission to pick any piece in their whole whole catalog and write a poem. So I picked Agnes Martin because I really like her work, and I also didn't really understand it. So that's also why I picked it. And I wrote this poem during maybe slightly after the Atlanta shooting, the spa shootings, and yeah, so I'll read it. It's called On a Clear Day, 1973. On a clear day, the horses disappeared. Just the apples they had been fed were left. The apples were strewn across the field and had become rectangles. When people found them, they still gathered and ate them. The people who hunched over their apples were far away, but the sounds of their chewing were over here. On a clear day, all the sounds fit into the boxes. On any clear day, all my thinking fits into boxes that can't be opened. What if our thinking was never meant to come out? If it only remains thinking within boxes? When out, it becomes weapons, takes on different shapes with sharp points. Today, there's no shortage of thinking, but all the thinking is divided into portions. Today, I'm hungry, but all the portions are gone. There are only 48. On clear days, there are only 48 birds, 48 people, and 48 houses, and 48 wars, and 48 apples. I keep counting grids, but no matter how I try, I still get 6 dead Asian women who don't fit into 48 boxes. All night, my thoughts are shaped like birds. In the morning, I lean in closer to the mirror, and someone has drawn lines across my face. I realize that failure consists of both the outline and the outlined, that lines are not meant to hold in our emptiness. So she, looking at her stuff, I end up just counting a lot. So people sometimes read that book with my back to the world, and they're like, oh, there are a lot of numbers and counting in there, and that's why, oh, this is what my poem looks like. Sometimes I made things that looked like some of her pieces. Other times I also did some drawings and on like vellum paper and just sort of did erasures of my own work for fun. Let's see, the time I'm looking. I'm going to read, let's see. That's another one. It's hard to see, but toward the end of her life, she started doing more like colorful things and started naming them things like happiness and versus this prior period where a lot of the things were untitled. So I'll just show you that. They're really beautiful and they're really large. And sometimes I think scale is why they're so powerful. So if you ever see one in a museum, you'll kind of maybe see why they're really cool. Oh, this is one that I'm not going to read, but that's after this one. And this is hard to see, but they're actually, do you see the little dots on the side? So she, on the back of a lot of her paintings and pieces would have like mathematical calculations because she had to like figure out exactly what she was going to do. And she saw a vision, she said, of her pieces as like little mini postage stamps in her eyes or in her head before she actually painted them, which is so interesting to me because I never see my poems before I write them. I just start writing and then I wander too much usually, but she had to measure, and it's hard to see, but these is the red lines throughout. And maybe I'll read this one just to give you an idea of how long you'll have to sit here and listen to me. I'll read this one. I'm trying to balance what I was told, how long I was told to read and how long I want you to have to sit and listen. And then I'll read a few from this longer poem today, but I'll read just a few tiny pieces and I'll read one more. So it's essentially, it's like 3 more poems. Okay. This one's called Red Bird, 1964. I've only seen a dead bird up close once. It wasn't red, but blue. I named it Happiness before I buried it. My child found a few sticks so we could make a cross. We dug a hole and dropped the bird in, along with a few flowers we plucked. We didn't touch the bird with our bare hands in case death was contagious. When I put the cross into the ground, I felt that Nietzsche was wrong. Happiness isn't the feeling that power increases. The lake isn't a marketplace. The small pencil marks on the painting aren't measuring anything. Seeing the dead bird up close only made me want to cover it, not sell its feelings. I'm far away from it in another house, but I still have the bird's feelings in a small box. Each spring, I can't see the baby birds in the rafters that, when hungry, sound like death. All these months, I thought they were birds, but it turns out they were really rats, and the feelings in the small box were my own. Okay, So I'm going to tell you about one more artist. Does anyone know who this artist is besides Chris? Who said he fell in love with this artist when he was 18 years old. This artist is On Kawara. O-N is the first name, Kawara, K-A-W-A-R-A. He's an abstract and conceptual artist. He's known for a lot of things, but these are his date paintings. So from 1966 to 2013, almost 50 years, he made thousands of these monochromatic canvases with red, blue, or gray with a date painted in white. And the cool thing is, if you can see the convention of the date's different because he changed the sort of the date convention depending on what country that he was in at the time. He also sent postcards to people that basically said, I woke up at 4 a.m. So that's it. And he would send that to his friends wherever they were. And so there are all these postcards flying around with like just really basic things like I went to bed at 10:43. Like, if these weren't done by midnight and painted these all by hand, he destroyed them. And when he died, instead of saying he died in 2014, he wanted his obituary to say that he lived for 29,771 days. Just kind of learning about that just made me kind of flip my own thinking about living and dying. And it's very sort of taught me how to think about time and live in the present. And during my father's last days in hospice, I thought I would write a few lines, 10 syllables each, based, sort of inspired by On Kawara, but ended up writing over many weeks because he lived a bit longer than I thought he would. He also sometimes clipped newspaper clippings from the day that he painted those, and the newspaper's clippings are just in a box, but they're never shown, but they're usually together. Oh, not yet. Okay. I'll just read a few tiny ones. January 9th, 2022. Someone says your eyelid almost came off. The doctors tried to reattach it. I close my eye all day to see if I can feel you're dying. What is dying but a form of hunger visible to God? When we pull down your shirt, your good eye opens. All the waiting. The moon is an athlete. January 12th, 2022. There's a name for it, the way your mouth stays open, no breathing. We hold our breaths as if companions to your dying. Shine Stokes, named after 2 doctors. What if we named everything? The last hand squeeze before death, the way your eye looks at me when I talk, the way the reincarnated cry the most, bewildered by the star's second blink. January 15th, 2022. Maybe we feel dizzy because we are moving and so is the earth. On some days, I can tell the earth is rotating in another direction. Today, I meet a hospice nurse named Harsh. He is sweet, sweet. January 16th, 2022. They drop the morphine under your tongue, how it must feel like a faint raindrop taken from the sky. It's been 2 weeks since the fall, and death still catches me by surprise. I feel nothing. It is raining morphine. These are kind of sad. Sorry. Okay. And then I'll read just the last one. It's just one line. And then I'll read one more poem. February 17th, 2022. Each of us comes from somewhere with blossoms. All right. This is the last one. And this is by Agnes Martin. And has anyone seen this? It's in the MoMA sometimes in New York. It's really gorgeous. It's 6 feet 3 inches by 6 feet 3 inches. So it's pretty tall. I'm 5'7"-ish. It's huge. And this is one of the 3 pieces she made with gold leaf. Oh, that's something by Ital Adnan. There. So that's how big it is. And yeah, it's really beautiful. There. I don't know why I'm so obsessed with the size, but it's called Friendship 1963. Thank you so much for listening. I came to the city so I could see gold. When I arrived, though, the leaves were gold too, and I became confused. I called the front desk 4 times, and Angel answered each time. By the 3rd call, he ended with, "Talk soon." In the morning, a different man answered, and I burst into tears. On 53rd Street, small children kept on running into me. A father yelled so loudly at the boy on the scooter that I thought he knew I was carrying death on my back. By the time I arrived at the museum, there was a long line. The bald man in front of me kept turning around to look at me. I could tell by his forehead that he could hurt me. When I finally found the room, I was the only one in there. Everyone else was below me in the Picasso room. While I stared at the gold rectangles, 2 attendants talked about whether to work overtime and get paid time and a half. I wanted to tell them that there's no such thing as time, just time and a half. Sometime in the night, Ital Adnan, I'll show you some of her pieces, Palestinian American poet or Palestinian actually, poet and writer. Sometime in the night, Ital Adnan had died. I had just seen her paintings the day before. The crowds were large, and I wondered whether our looking had accelerated her death. When I took a photo of Agnes's piece, I saw my dark reflection on the gold. I started counting the grids, but the bald man came up next to me. Suddenly, there were 2 dark shadows on the gold. I asked him to step away, but when he said, "No," it was Agnes's voice. Thank you. Okay. Are any of you poets in here or write poetry? Yeah. Nobody here? There's one. There's another. Good. Don't be embarrassed. It's not embarrassing. So I'm really excited to talk about this wonderful Witness Prize. So Jake Adam York was actually a friend of mine. I was thinking about how I miss him so much. I think about him so often. And he and I became friends because we were at the same press together, and he invited me to Colorado where he was teaching to do an event, and we spent a lot of time together. And he was one of the kindest people that I knew in poetry. He had these piercing eyes, and so I kind of think of his poems as being kind and piercing at the same time. They have a kind of leisurely sort of conversational tone, but they reckon with really, really difficult historical things in racism and him growing up in the South in really interesting ways. And he was one of the few people at the time, I think, that was really writing these kinds of poems. So I'm so glad to be able to be here. I miss him so much. I think about him all the time, and I'm so glad that this award is named after him. It means a lot to me. So I'm here to talk about Erika's poem, and it's a short little thing I wrote. Actually, I'm going to read the beginning of the email that I sent to them when I picked the person that I wanted, or the poem because I didn't know who it was. I'll just read a little bit of that and I added a little bit more. First of all, congratulations, Erika. I was telling her that it's really hard to be sort of like the last person. Like there's so many entrants to everything. And if anything, I hope this encourages you just to keep writing. The imagery in this poem is arresting and strange. Right away, the poem sets expectations toward strangeness. Quote, "Running into the mountains, they tie red ribbons around their necks to scare the wolves," unquote. The red ribbons then morph to, quote, "fire around our necks," unquote. The poem continues to morph again and again in such electric and interesting ways that feel dreamlike, surreal, as the speaker grasps and grapples toward a mother figure. There's also an insistent anaphora. So anaphora is when like a word or phrase is repeated at the front of a line of poetry. A lot of spoken word poets like to use anaphora. Anaphora of, quote, "I found my mother," which along with the many disparate dreamlike scenes actually unsettles and creates a constellated mother figure who is everywhere in history, in memory, not quite memory or stories, yet who is impossible to locate, to piece together. The ending of the poem encapsulates how one can never know a mother, especially in the diaspora, where the mother is no longer attached to a country. Please welcome Erika Jing.
Hello, can everyone hear me in the back? Perfect. Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to Victoria Chang, to the Jules Collins Smith Museum, to Southern Humanities Review, and everyone who made this event possible. It's truly been an honor. I'm Erika. I'm a student at Williams College. I'm also a junior editor for Sine Theta magazine. So just a quick introduction about myself. I'm from New Jersey, but I've also lived in Beijing, Shanghai, and Massachusetts. So I feel like this is reflected in a lot of my poetry. I wander a lot, but as Victoria Chang said. But I'm very thankful to be among people and poets and writers and teachers that I really love and admire, and obviously everyone else who was involved in the Auburn Witness Prize. And I'm very honored to share a stage with Victoria and with Jake Adam York, whose life and work has made the world so much more vibrant and so much more true. I'm going to first read Follow, which was actually written for my mother, and I'm really grateful that she's here with me today, the day after her birthday, to share this moment with me. But I'm going to read this poem, then I'll talk more about it afterwards, and then I'll share a couple more poems, and I'll end with a poem by Fadi Judah. Follow. Running into the mountains, they tied red ribbons around their necks to scare the wolves. They're afraid of fire. We have fire around our necks. I retraced my steps down the pitched path until I found my mother asleep. I found her in the stable on top of a hay bale next to the horses. I found her not in Tianjin, but the dew-wrought fields of Mongolia. I found my mother tracing her feet through quilted dawn, steady against the roadside, the rolls of fabric bumping into no one but the gasps of trees as they crackle and find love beneath ice. She unrolls the fabric until the trees are puddled under sun. On dirt, she watches other vendors wheel by racks of red coats. The school children glance past on their bikes. The mothers buy flour with necklaces under their sweaters until the dribbling trees have hardened again. I follow her footsteps, thin soles padding, the rolls swinging home, her throat a patch of gold against blue, blue night. I found my mother, peanuts swelling in her pockets, cheeks forgiving the rot of winter, reddened by baijiu. Her mother loved peanuts, but she was months away. Slips of skin flaking between cloth, between hands. I found my mother outside in a blanket of snow. Her grandfather sent her out as her sisters slept. She mixed the dregs of waking with dirt and corn to feed the pigs. I found my mother's hair burning in Beishan. She was the only girl clawing up the fences. The boys fought for fire tongs to curl her hair. On New Year's Eve, she wore a string of glass pearls, her hair twined through like a smoking ribbon. I found her entering a maze sown through with watermelons, unsettling the horizon, their bellies heavy, cream-colored on leathered shoulders. Late, as hands picked nonstop and feet slowed beneath dirt, I found a wooden cart. Inside, opening a watermelon, my mother, the sun smeared around her lips, trickling, beating into a loose white shirt. I found my mother, and she did not find mine. The past does not mind the future. How do I find my mother without finding home? So I wrote Follow during a period of struggle, both personal and literary and poetic. I was at the time in Professor Jessica Fisher's workshop, and so we talked a lot about these issues as I was experiencing them, because during those 2 months in the workshop, poetry had never come as slowly as it had or as unnatural, because none of the things that I wrote felt true. It felt like I was forgetting how to write poetry, and I was forgetting the beats and the rhythms and the images that came as well. So in conversations with Professor Fisher, we talked a lot about how I was going through a moment of stylistic change, because for much of my very young experience as a poet, I focused a lot on imitation, and that's all I knew to do back in middle school and high school. And so she encouraged me to read widely and to write deeply, and most of all, to just live and experience college for what was my freshman year. And so I did that, and I actually read Obit by Victoria Chang. And it was also around that time I had been calling my mom basically every single night, because while over the summer, we would go on these really long walks where she would just tell me stories about her childhood that I was trying to understand as someone, a part of the diaspora, as I was not born in China and she was. And I was also understanding through these stories her and my grandmother and my grandmother's mother, who had already passed away. And so during these stories, I think it was the collision of hearing my mother's childhood and reading Obit that this poem came about. And it almost felt like a trance while I was writing it, because I was returning to themes I had attempted to outgrow and themes that I had been afraid to confront. A lot of it was about memory, about family, illness, and childhood and trauma. But I realized that these are memories and these are moments that aren't all mine, but I needed to grapple with and recognize and articulate through poetry before I could write anything new. And so that's what I did. And my speaker returns again and again to memory and stows away in this liminal space. But the poems that I'm going to read now are written around the same time period. They're all very short. So thank you all for your time and thank you for waiting. The first poem is called Retrace. Retrace. When death comes by our window, I will first repeat all my words. Burn, bush, bird, breaking breath, have, had, has, lived, lift, lick, dark, hearth, heat, heap, leap, season. I will brush his shoulders once the doors open. And the next poem is called Family Business, and both of these poems were previously published in the Passion Fruit Review. Family business. We don't run a pizza shop, laundromat, or corner store. The big boss likes to dictate as big men do. He chides as they do. He doles out praise as God upon hearing Adam pray for tenderness. Kneels down beside him, fingers soft and wandering, part his open chest, pries out wet, a gleaming, grieving little bone. And then now I have one final poem. It's relatively newer, and this one is called Storytelling. I stood on the path once taken. I stood by the trees I once hung, pitched with fruit. I stood with my pen and put in the work. The grass I laid with snow, the ditch I padded shallow. The gates I raised higher, the walls I made lower, the school lonelier and smaller. The day closes on a hand hesitating by the table, reaching, waiting, guided by slow waves of conversation. A dropped vowel splits down the side of the table, and the hand is now a hand that rings, rains, floods the floor with tiny sun-ripe shrapnels. I retrace my steps. I follow him down the snaking path, up the trees as he steals apples from the neighbors' yards, across dirt lots, sunsets becoming puddles under their tires. I follow him, bike going up and down. He goes down, twists off the bike, down on his hands. Thank God there was padding, they said. Thank God it wasn't too deep. Thank God there was snow. The day closes in at our backs, still, upright. The glass is just a shell, breaking against a larger shell, retracing its steps. It draws the home a little colder, your shoes a little damper. It writes a sprained wrist into a broken bone. I kneel in the direction of your wrist, slight, bented towards the crash. And now I'm hoping just to end my reading in the voice of the poet Fadi Judah, a Palestinian-American poet, and I believe his poem, Sunbird, is incredibly important to me and to the moment that we're all in, because right now we're all witnesses. Sunbird. I flit from gleaming river to glistening sea, from all that we to all that me, fresh east to salty west, southern sweet and northern free. There is a lake between us, and aquifers for cactus, and basins of anemone, from the river to the sea, from womb to breath, and one with oneness, I be from the river to the sea. Thank you.
All right, so we have time for some questions, and I have a microphone. I will walk around, and if you could wait for me to give you the microphone before you ask your question, that would be lovely. Could I see some hands of anybody who might be interested in asking a question? All right, in the back.
Hi, I have a question for Victoria. Looking at all of the Agnes Martin paintings, they're very minimalistic and simplistic, and your poems get a lot of emotion in them. So I just kind of want to know like your process when looking at the pictures and the paintings and everything, and how you can get all that emotion in your pieces.
That's a great question. I was going through a really hard time. I mean, to be honest, I was really sad and depressed. My father had just passed away, and I'm kind of a little bit naturally melancholic, although people who know me outside of poetry would never think that. But internally, I think that's where I channel that melancholy, is through the poetry. And Agnes Martin is just, I don't know, at some point, I just felt like those grids, I was like walking in them. Like there's something about that minimalist the grids that gave me enough space to actually feel like I could talk about some of these things that I was feeling. People sometimes ask me, after they read that book, they think it's so depressing, and they asked me if I'm okay. And I'm like, I was so happy writing those poems, and I felt so liberated because she helped me, her work helped me realize that I was feeling so sad. Sometimes life just, you just kind of go along and you don't even know, because we're so desensitized to our own emotions and our feelings. So I think she was dealing with a lot of mental health things herself, and she was becoming really well known in New York, and was just turned her back to the whole art world, gave away her paintbrushes to a bunch of younger painters, and took off, and didn't start back painting until like 7 years later. And she built her own little house in New Mexico and just lived a very solitary life. And I always think like, oh, someone has like her paintbrushes, like someone has that blue that she painted, the really beautiful blue painting, and they just don't know. I just think that's such a cool story. So maybe there's a little bit of her story that I resonated with too. I mean, it's hard to be alone today, but how come we all feel so alone? It's the strangest thing. Like, we're constantly barraged with information. There's people everywhere. You can access things everywhere. But it's like, I think I feel very alone sometimes. And I think that she felt that way too. And that's sort of how I connected with her.
All right, I see your hand coming down.
Yeah, thank you. Those are both, all of your work was very wonderful. I have a question that's sort of for both of you. First, Erika, you said that Victoria's book, Obit, inspired your poem, Follow. I was just asking if you could say something more about that. And secondly, Victoria, how do you think Follow was inspired by you?
Well, I would say it was during that period of time where I was trying to figure out how to really read poetry and draw from poets without necessarily imitating them. And I think reading Obit was when I really saw how you were metabolizing the grief that you're experiencing. And I was experiencing something similar. And so seeing the way that you processed it, and through writing, and also through a form that you initially did not want to write in, but ended up writing in, made me realize how I could, this isn't a direct answer, but it made me realize how I could metabolize memories and experiences that I was working through, and come to a form that felt more natural and didn't feel as forced as before. And so I guess that's a very roundabout way of saying that I really just drew inspiration from imagining how you wrote. And then that's what really put me in the state to write my own poem.
I love that. I mean, I think that is such an inspiring response, and what a great question, because I feel like other people's art really gives us permission to just be ourselves. Because every poem or every story or every whatever you're working on, visual art, sculpture, podcast, whatever, I feel like every single thing is asking us something of us, the artist. And I feel like as an artist, sometimes we will ourselves too much onto a piece or into the piece. And so I kind of love that, like, you were reading my work, but it didn't make you want to do exactly what I did, but it gave you permission to listen to your own poem and your own voice and the things that you were feeling inside. I think that's really beautiful and inspiring. And yeah, I hear that sometimes from people when they tell me, especially when they read my book, Dear Memory, writers especially are like, oh my gosh, it just unlocked something for them. Usually it's their own family stories. The fact that we really don't know anything about our family members, like that like our parents, we may think we know them, but they have such a private life that we can't possibly know. I also think about how, like, when your parents die, they knew you when you were little, but you didn't know yourself when you were little. And so like these memories of you that you couldn't possibly remember are now gone. And I just think about all those interesting things in that book, Dear Memory, that inspires other writers that they always tell me. And I think that's so beautiful. So I definitely, there were, in my email, I wrote entry 5, entry 6, and entry 7 were other ones that I liked, kind of thing. But this poem to me was just so strange. And I feel like so many poems today sound like other poems. It's the MFA industrial complex, right? But and then it's so easy to read stuff online and things like that. But it's very unusual to look for like different weird language combinations. And that's what this poem of Erika's I saw immediately. So, and I love a mother poem, obviously, because I love my mother and I miss her all the time. And I think that mothers hold a special place in all of our hearts, no matter what kind of relationship that we had with our mothers. So I love the mother poems. And so when I saw this, I immediately resonated with it. And I didn't necessarily think it sounded like my poems or anything, but I saw some similar things like memory, lack of memory, and just trying to know. And I think that's what a poem can be sometimes. It's like trying to know. It never knows in the end, because I think a poem is silence, a poem is a lack, but the trying you can feel in that poem.
I think to what you're saying, as Audre Lorde says, like poetry is a force of illumination, and it helps create something where I didn't and your poem helped me realize that there's a place, like language did not exist there to explain these memories for me before, and watching how you were able to create the language to do that helped me as well. And I think, as you were saying, you don't really know yourself from when you were a child, and that's something only your parents knew. Like I didn't know my mother's childhood, and I'll never be able to really understand it. And so part of the poem of chasing down her childhood and the fairy tale, the mythic aspect of it, draws a lot from the fact that I don't truly know. And a lot of it is me creating stories from her stories that are fairy tales to me.
Hi, both of you guys have such beautiful work, and I'm just like shaking in awe that I have this microphone right now. But I really appreciate how you both play with length and form in your work, and speaking on the fact that poetry is sometimes silence, is sometimes a lack. Sometimes when I'm writing, I feel like I have a difficulty knowing like, okay, this thought is now done. How do you guys know when you're like, I have finished this poem, this work is done in, 10 syllables or 10 lines or, pages worth of content? Because I really appreciate that variation between both of what your readings were.
Wasn't it Paul Valery that said a poem is never finished, but it's just sort of abandoned? I feel like this morning I had a lot of extra time, and so I started, the hotel like totally let me print out my whole manuscript, and I was like, okay. But I started working on this manuscript that I'm working on, and it's like I keep thinking I'm done or I'm almost done, but then I keep reading it and it's like I'm not done. I just keep making changes. So the way that I think about it is like, just keep working until the pages come out kind of clean. It's kind of practical. So I just keep working on stuff and working on it and just, just leaving time. I mean, we get busy, so time just passes and then you go back and you're like, oh, I don't even remember writing this, and then you make changes. And I feel like just keep working on it. And then I've even felt like after I've turned in a manuscript before it's supposed to be published, and then that last chance I get to copy edit it or edit it, I'm like, oh my gosh, and I panic because it doesn't feel like I've changed. And we were talking about this beforehand too. You were saying how you felt like there are poems that you wrote before and that now you're like, oh, I don't really like those anymore. And I was telling Erika that I read poems, like poets I used to love, and then time passes and I'm like, I don't love that poet anymore. I've grown, I've changed, I've read more. I think we're constantly moving, which makes it hard to answer that question. But I think at some point you just kind of get tired of something too. So I sort of beat things to death, and then I've kind of had enough. And like those little miniature poems, I knew a whole bunch of those weren't really working that well, but I had already counted syllables, recounted them, crossed out whole poems, started over so many times that I just didn't want to deal with it anymore. So I think there's that aspect of things too.
And I
Also
think,
send them to your friends. They can tell you. Yeah.
sorry. But definitely, I think that was something I was also working with during the poem, and just figuring out how to sustain the energy of a poem as you write it, and for how long I could sustain this through the sequence that I was writing. And I would just say that I stopped, and I tend to overwrite as well, but at the end, I realized I would stop when the poem no longer felt true. What I was writing felt more like I was writing it just for the sake of making it 2 pages, or for the sake of having, a pattern or following the form. And I ended up cutting a lot of stanzas as well in the poem. It used to be much longer. So I guess my answer is just see how long you can sustain the energy. And once it no longer feels true to you, that might be when to stop.
And reading aloud. That's always a good test. Yeah, reading aloud.
I think we have time for one last question. No pressure. Yeah, all right.
On the other side of the room.
Almost there. Hold on.
Thank you both. Beautiful poems. I find both of your poems extremely visual. And I know that, you are clearly and explicitly inspired by visual art, but I wonder if you think about your poetic work as in part a matter of visualizing what you're trying to understand, not simply bringing it to words, your memories, your experiences, but also if you think that you think through those memories and experiences by way of visualizing them.
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, all of these questions have been really great. I sometimes ask people, or poets, or sometimes my students, not always, like, what matters to you the most as an artist or as a writer? Like what do you think about first? And for me, your question answers that question for me. I'm an imagist. I love the image first, and I love this sort of strange image, and so I'm always trying to think of new ways to describe like something really, really common, like whatever these things are. I'll think of something to describe, like the stranger the better. And that's really the first place that I think about what my poems are trying to do. And so, yeah, think about that if you're a writer, like what am I thinking about first? Me is image, and then maybe next is rhythm, sound. And so I'm constantly, like, I was trying to whisper in the hotel room because I didn't want people to hear me talking and reading, but I read my poems aloud hundreds and hundreds of times because I'm listening for the way language and rhythm moves and where things catch and where I take breaths and things like that. But yes, 100%. How about you?
I think definitely. I think when I read, it appears as a movie in my head. And so the same thing with poetry. When I'm reading a poem, I like watching how the images and then the phrasing, how the metaphors shift every part of the poem. And I just remember I was rereading Obit this morning. I remember how you wrote when language died, and then the poem just took language and kept transforming it. And I just watched this concept of language change and become images to me, and that was very powerful. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, while I was writing the poem and while my mom was telling me her stories, I was seeing them play out as movies, and even though they may not necessarily be true, they were true to me, and that's what I tried to put down on the page because that's the closest I would probably ever get to the truth.
That was wonderful. I think we have to wrap it up here, but thank you both so much for being with us. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. And I think we'll have a book signing right out in the lobby area. If afterwards, if anyone's interested, stick around.